Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about how the Infectious Disease Society is in partnership with Big Pharma, and what does that mean? Basically, Big Pharma is a very powerful special interest in our U.S. government process. Every 5 years, there are two major federal bills that control drug safety and other medical safety issues. Prior to the 2012 legislative reform on these two major bills, Big Pharma spent $770 million to influence the outcome of this legislation, basically to reduce quality control and other kind of steps in which to generate new drugs so that things could get to market faster with fewer controls and fewer testings in place. And this investment netted them well over $11 billion. So that's not a bad investment. And they did this through, proper channels as registered lobbying groups. And, their names are on the bills, as are all the other lobbying groups that were working on these things. But I'm just saying that they are very powerful in that regard. And the IDSA closely collaborates with Big Pharma on a number of areas. And this is all documented. There is the 2010 Master IDSA Money Trail that was done by investigative reporter Chris Newby that can be reviewed for this information. And the information I got about the $770 million and the amounts is all available through usgov.spend. So these sites have this information readily available. So what does this mean? Well, the CDC orientation to Lyme policy and program is the result of a very enmeshed relationship with the IDSA. The key CDC directors are responsible for Lyme are also IDSA members. There are no non-IDSA members among the directors making up the chain of command responsible for the CDC Lyme policy and programs. So if you go to the CDC website and get the organogram of the entire institution, you will see a number of photographs and titles and division names, and you will see that the Office of Infectious Diseases, Kabatz, Lima Kabatz, who reports directly to the CDC director, she's a member of the IDSA. Under her is a person by the name of Beth Bell for the National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases. She reports to Kabatz, who reports to the director of the CDC. She's a member of the IDSA, and under her is another member of IDSA by the name of Peterson, Lyle Peterson, and he's in charge of the division of vector-borne diseases. So these are all members of the IDSA, and IDSA is closely linked with Big Pharma, and they have this very important role in national security and other concerns. There is a long and very documented history of conflicts of interest within the IDSA membership as it relates to Lyme disease. And this is very, very documented by a series of research pieces that was done by Lorraine Johnson and Chris Newby, and as part of the 2008 antitrust suit that was taken by the state of Connecticut against the IDSA. Anyway, the conflicts of interest include patents on Lyme test kits, accepting payments from vaccine manufacturers regarding Lyme disease, consulting for health insurance companies that rely on IDSA Lyme guidelines to restrict coverage to patients. So they act as expert consultants to the insurance companies that restrict care to patients. And they also act and provide medical expert opinion in medical legal cases against doctors and patients regarding Lyme treatment. So this is all the ways in which they directly profit from having this very outdated Lyme guidelines in place. In 2008, the antitrust against the IDSA found that an ad hoc group convened during government-funded closed-door meetings and had members who were researchers with significant commercial interest in Lyme disease tests and vaccines. It excluded the public and researchers whose views were not aligned with those of the IDSA. The group essentially set national Lyme disease policy and controlled the national research agenda in Lyme disease without public oversight or transparency. This is in violation of the law, by the way. Subsequently, a large percentage of government grants were awarded to the IDSA group's members. So this is a great paper. It's called Overview of Lymegate Findings by Chris Newby and Lorraine Johnson. And it is part of the antitrust documentation and the 2012 field hearing on Lyme disease. The IDSA has spent a lot of money discrediting their competitors. The most recent one is called the Please study in 2016. It's being represented as an independent study by a Dutch research group. However, the main author, Arend, has actually produced very recent publications for the IDSA that are copyrighted. So there's really no degree of separation. He is working with the IDSA and for the IDSA. And actually, the purpose of this particular study was to discredit the competitor's treatment protocol, and that's actually stated in the grant purpose. One of the earliest efforts to discredit the competitor was the 2 controlled trials of antibiotic treatment in patients with persistent symptoms and a history of Lyme disease. And that came out in 2001, but it was actually printed before it came out on the NIH, NIAID websites. And it never actually was brought to completion. The methodology was not finalized before they printed the results. The results are kind of spurious. And again, this was basically to discredit a competitor's treatment protocol. The IDSA has interfered with the allocation of grants to study microbiology of chronic Lyme and chronic Lyme studies submitted at the state level. This has been documented on numerous occasions, and there will be more documentation forthcoming on this. So basically, they're spending a lot of money and time trying to discredit their competitors. Let's see. The main competing organization is called the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society. They have developed protocols that are patient-centered. They understand Lyme is a complex and serious illness that requires patient-centered treatment options. And according to their own articles printed by IDSA with an NIH author, they have claimed that millions of tax dollars have been spent refuting the ILADS claims. It's an amazing point to discover. They actually say millions of dollars. But this is in the Anti-Science and Ethical Concerns Associated with Advocacy of Lyme Disease article that was printed in the Lancet in 2011. And they actually admit to spending money to refute the claims of competitors. Now I want to talk about a number of NIH grants that were misappropriated with a specific purpose to marginalize Lyme patients. One is that, just to give you an idea of what grants are, a grant is not to be used to acquire property or services for the federal government's direct benefit, and it does not have substantial involvement from the government when carrying out the activity contemplated in the agreement. Basically, a grant is when 2 organizations, the federal government and another organization that isn't the federal government, have similar objectives, and the government says, we like what you're doing, it follows what we're trying to do, and they give them money. So there's no direct costs for services rendered. However, in this case, there were some exceptions. There were a number of actors. One was a senior NIH official, that's National Institutes for Health official. There were IDSA guideline authors for Lyme disease. There was a previous NIH grantee, Yale University, University of Pennsylvania, and they misappropriated monies from translational research grants, patient-oriented research, and historical review grants. When I talk about the term misappropriation, I mean that the intentional use of the money has not been used in that way. It has been used for unauthorized purposes. In other words, the grant was given to meet certain objectives and it was applied to meet other objectives. And how do we know this? Because monies from grants have to be logged in when there's publications and their grant numbers are disclosed. So it's very obvious information if you do the research. It involved 6 different NIH grants, and it involved $11,825,000, over almost $12 million. The NIH employee is named McSweeney. The Yale professor is named Shapiro. And basically, they used grants that were supposed to move knowledge and discovery gained from basic sciences to clinical and community settings, also known as bench to bedside. And they also, monies that were supposed to conduct high-quality, patient-oriented research to answer important clinical questions and to mentor physicians, young physicians, who conduct patient-oriented research. That's what the money was set aside for. And instead, what they did was they prepared and wrote an article called "The Anti-Science and Ethical Concerns Associated with Advocacy of Lyme Disease." It was posted in the Lancet Infectious Diseases Journal in 2011 and eventually appeared on PubMed, the central database for government-funded publications, in 2015. NIH employee McSweeney writes the first and subsequent drafts, which would be considered substantial involvement. The article mischaracterizes and discredits the Lyme community. It dismisses and trivializes a number of crippling Lyme symptoms and complications. It portrays the Lyme community as a threat to true science, true Lyme scientists and academics. It misrepresents ILADS as an anti-science and unethical organization, which is very curious given the ILADS Lyme guidelines are posted on the federally sanctioned National Guidelines Clearinghouse website. It asserts that unknown yet powerful money groups control and dispatch Lyme advocates for nefarious purposes, which is amazing. And basically, it just reveals that the NIH, the CDC, and IDSA have a great deal of bias against Lyme patients and a great deal of bias regarding Lyme science that is not based on science. It makes one true statement, and it says that there is no deficiency of either new patients or activists, which is true. I mean, we have an out-of-control epidemic, which is constantly recruiting new people. The second article involves University of Pennsylvania, and again, NIH employee McSweeney says, activists and self-described Lyme victims who devoted years of efforts to raising an obscure tick-borne nuisance in Old Lyme, Connecticut, to a national reportable disease. He writes this to the editor of the Cambridge Journal on Infectious Diseases. He does not like the fact that Lyme is getting national attention. And later that year, we got this through Freedom of Information Act. I didn't do this. This was Chris Newby who got this. An email saying, anyone know of any academic sociologists or historians interested in doing a paper on the politics of Lyme disease? Maybe Robert Aronowitz at University of Pennsylvania. So McSweeney, as an NIH employee, is trying to recruit somebody to write a particular paper. And at this time, Aronowitz had received 6 NIH grants by 2007. So in 2008, coincidentally, he gets another grant. He actually gets 3 grants, all with the same objectives in the next couple of years. And the purpose of the grants is to contribute to effective disease prevention policies and practices and suggest greater inclusiveness in policymaking by individuals and groups with a legitimate stake in the outcomes of prevention policies. And this has been published in 2012 in the Milbank Quarterly. It's called The Rise and Fall of Lyme Disease Vaccines, a Cautionary Tale for Risk Interventions in American Medicine and Public Health by Baranowitz. The article is derived from A History of Health Risks in American Society and Medicine, which is the larger book that he got the grant to write. However, it's all part of the grant production and publication. So this article diverges quite a bit from its original objectives. And basically he recommends that there should, to stop the conversation between the Lyme experts and the patient advocates, forego engagement of patient advocates as stakeholders and members of the public, exclude their patient-centered views, ignore their voiced concerns, or propose solutions. This is just stunning because it runs counter to all U.S. federal and state policies and standards for best practices regarding patient-centered medicine and, of course, open government. And the fact that it was used by NIH grants with a directive from an NIH employee is just really stunning. So these grants, not only do they misappropriate monies for the wrong, to discredit Lyme patients, but on basic performance, they do not comply to the grant objectives. They do not meet basic performance standards. The government had a substantial role and involvement, and the grantee appears to be providing direct benefit to the NIH, which are violations of grant agreements. In addition, the anti-science article delayed posting to PubMed, the federal database for publications sponsored by the U.S. government, by 3 years, which is non-compliance. It should have been there within a year. There's very low accountability for the content because the names of the authors kept shifting around between who was first in the Lancet versus in the PubMed. And there was also a conflict of interest that was not disclosed. The Lancet editor is one of the authors, and that was not disclosed under the conflict of interest areas. And in general, there are just so many conflicts of interest. If you read the article, and I ask you to do so, the list of conflicts of interest basically makes the entire content of the article lack any credibility. So basically, tax dollars were used to marginalize the Lyme community, to further IDSA professional and financial interests, and to reinforce the misrepresentation of Lyme science. In addition, these two articles have contaminated many other pieces of publication because they have been cited in them. For example, a quote from one of the articles came out back in March, and within 3 hours it was on 889 platforms. So we don't even know how far these misappropriated grants and these articles have contaminated and undermined other quote-unquote scientific articles and representations of Lyme patients and Lyme science. In 2015, the Office of the Inspector General made a series of recommendations regarding grant management for the NIH and the CDC. And I found from my review of what's happened with these grants that I'm in complete agreement with what they recommended. So I'm basically going to repeat a couple of their recommendations and make them specific to Lyme disease. 1, quote, take more aggressive action to identify poorly performing grantees and those at risk of misspending federal dollars and prevent them from continuing to receive grant funds. I would agree. 2, continue to provide training on identifying and pursuing misconduct in grants and contracts, certainly. 3, actively coordinate with and refer potential fraud to the Office of the Inspector General for investigation, which I plan to do with this information. 4, implement a program to actively pursue fraud under the Program Fraud Civil Remedies Act, the PFCRA. I also have some recommendations that I came up with as a result of these actions. 1. Initiate immediate oversight and stringent review of all current Lyme grants to all of IDSA's institutional affiliations by impartial parties. 2. Require deep institutional analysis by independent party regarding how IDSA financial interests have shaped NIH resources and allocations regarding Lyme and co-infections research and CDC Lyme policies and programs. 3. Have an immediate moratorium or stop on all IDSA engagement in any and all government activities related to Lyme disease and co-infections. Again, I'm talking specifically to Lyme disease and co-infections, not all the work that IDSA has been involved with. Investigate all individual and institutional actors implicated in these misappropriations. That would be the authors of the articles, the institutions, NIH, the CDC, Aronowitz, McSweden. 5. NIH Lyme awards to these actors to be suspended until the investigation is completed. That means any Lyme awards to Yale and University of Pennsylvania should be suspended, not just the ones under these articles. Pending the conclusion of the investigations, implicated federal employees should be barred from any management of monies, representational roles for their agencies, publications releases, and decision-making roles on all and any policies, programs, and research related to Lyme and co-infections. Now, what I've just listed here are really very standard practices whenever you are investigating fraud or waste. And I know this from my previous experience of working on federal programs that had these occurrences. Initiate immediate and comprehensive and formal countermeasure to the institutionalized practice of discrimination against Lyme patients and the Lyme community. Develop and extend a formal federal policy and statutes that confer special considerations, protections, and resources to Lyme patients. Now, what does that mean? Well, for those of you who may be familiar with the AIDS epidemic, these patients also faced institutionalized discrimination on the part of the federal government and the medical bodies that were supposed to serve them. And so eventually they were given special considerations as a way to make a commitment to helping people living with HIV. I believe that after 25 years of institutionalized marginalization on the part of the CDC, the way the CDC and the IDSA has gone after Lyme patients at the state level and tried to undermine state protections against them, the way in which bad science is being promoted that undermines any chance of good outcome for health, that we require special considerations. And these special considerations are to be developed with Lyme stakeholders that are identified and nominated by the Lyme community. They are to be extended and made accessible to Lyme patients throughout the nation, as are special considerations with other groups such as those living with HIV. And all recipients of government contracts, grants, and cooperatives agreements must make provisions for Lyme patients that conform to these special considerations. And this is very much in terms of people who are living with Lyme, who are also working, who have cycles of wellness and illness that should be protected and considered, because their illness is very much a product of bad governance. To give you another example of how the IDSA is discriminating against Lyme patients and how the CDC buys into this, I want to talk about the Antibiotic Stewardship Initiative. It's being used to exploit Lyme patients and to further restrict treatment options. For example, the IDSA worked with another organization to write antibiotic stewardship guidelines, and they reviewed a number of different patient groups. For example, end-of-life patients, premature infants, immunocompromised. And they identified one particular patient group that generates superbugs that we all fear may be, that are antibiotic resistant. And this patient group is Lyme patients. If you go to their website, you will see that they have advocacy letters claiming that Lyme patients who receive 1 month or more of antibiotics will generate superbugs that threaten the rest of humanity. It's stunning. If you go to the website and look at Lyme advocacy letters, you will see that exact language. The other thing is that their stewardship goals vary a great deal according to their financial interests. I'm talking about the IDSA. For example, they, in 2011, promoted the reintroduction of home infusion legislation. And home infusion legislation is basically, they have found a way in which to provide unending and open-ended antibiotics and other treatments through home infusion to various patient groups. And the reason they're interested in having these open source and open-ended antibiotic treatments for these patient groups is because they can get Medicare reimbursement. So it's going to generate income for ID specialists. And Alan Tice, one of the early presidents of the IDSA, founded the first outpatient intravenous infusion therapy association called OPVITA. So basically, this is an area where they're going to make money, and so they're promoting, prolonged and open-ended use of antibiotics, in this case, but not for Lyme patients who require it to improve their health and well-being. They claim that, IDSA claims that the benefits of antibiotic stewardship include improved patient outcomes and optimization of resource use. And in 2014, the Presidential Executive Order combating antibiotic-resistant bacteria is being now piloted. The U.S. government intends to promote global regulations for uniform antibiotic stewardship, and this makes perfect sense. We want to make sure that people can be treated as needed. We want to make sure that infectious diseases do not become all resistant to the antibiotics that we have. However, as I'm stating, the way in which Lyme patients are being treated is unique under this situation. Basically, IDSA is sitting in this initiative, they're active in the initiative, and they are restricting patients' access to antibiotics through this initiative. And this is regardless of their Lyme patient symptoms and in defiance of proven longer-term treatments by the group ILADS.